King is one of my favorites because he sacrificed his life for his people, and I don't see that level of commitment to anything nowadays. So I'm a little sensitive when it comes to King. He also didn't start out with a plan. He just was a human being that did different strategies as he went along and learned more. So he changed and he grew. And sometimes, a lot of times, he would be brought into movements that were already going on and they needed visibility. So they would call him in. So he wasn't the strategist of the entire civil rights movement. He changed and he grew, and he sometimes helped local movements and grassroots movements by appearing. And then that would bring in a lot of money.
Oh, Chuck, do you want to chime in real quick?
When people make the statement that, first of all, about King, how King sacrificed so much, notice how she didn't say anything about him. Again, this plays well into those who are trying to hype up moral melodramas in order to give themselves a sense of righteousness. She didn't say anything about him. We know that Dr. King lost his life for what he was doing. And it is because of that it gives this impression that men like King are beyond reproach. This is not an issue about what Dr. King did in his private life and whether he slept around on his wife and did these sorts of things. It wasn't just that MLK slept around on his wife. He had an affinity, not just for drug use, but he also had an affinity for prostitutes. But here's the difference in what King did in his private life versus what he put forth to the masses, because Dr. King was deceptive in that he knew that he was using the respectability of the Black religious leader to then push his socialist agenda. She said that Dr. King didn't have a plan. That's true to a certain extent, but it also isn't true. He didn't have a plan insofar as, to the left, the ends will always justify the means. And Dr. King would tailor and kind of change his message depending on the time and depending upon who he was talking to. She also said that she heard MLK and listened to a lot of the things that he said. Well, if she listened to a lot of the things that he said, I'm sure she had run across him saying several times that he was pushing for certain things as a basic universal income. This was going all the way back to the 1960s. I did not say, now, yes, it is true that Dr. King hung around a lot of communists, but that begs two questions. Why would a man who was not a communist hang around communists, right? Okay. And it also begs a second question. If MLK did believe in a basic universal income, does one have to openly admit that they are a Marxist in order to be identified as one when they say such things? Because we ought to know what it means to be a doctrinaire Marxist when we understand the ideology of Marxism to its core. I didn't say that MLK, or should I say what was most important about MLK was not the fact that he hung around communists, but that he was one. Just two totally different things. That takes it up to an entirely different level. And this is a man who called himself a reverend. She said, and I'm going to read this, mind you, I don't care about the fancy sympathetic things we have when it comes to MLK. This is a shirt from my good friend Chad O. Jackson. I'll mention him again. Worship God, not man. I don't worship MLK. He's not a God. He's not a deity. As a matter of fact, MLK, here's a man who rejected the divinity of Christ, and he knew exactly who he was, what he stood for, and what he set out to do before he was popularized and lionized by the media through their, of course, connections with men like Stanley Levison, his publicist, who made Dr. King appear larger than life. This is a letter, and I'm going to pass the floor. This is a letter that was written to Coretta Scott at the time. She was not married to him. This letter was dated July 18th, 1952. This is MLK speaking to Coretta, his soon-to-be wife. He says, "Let us continue to hope, work, and pray that in the future we will live to see a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race and color." Now, a brotherhood that transcends race and color is Christian in its ethic. But what part about a warless world and a better distribution of wealth is Christian? Then he goes on to say, this is a man who called himself a reverend. He was ordained a reverend. He also says in this letter, and I'm going to pass it, This is the gospel that I will preach to the world. And just to give full context, the gospel to which he was referring to is the social gospel that was impressed upon him by the likes of Walter Rauschenbusch, who was a Protestant theologian, who is seen as the father of Christian socialism. This was Dr. King's key and primary theological influence, was the Christian socialist, Walter Rauschenbusch. This was a letter he wrote to Coretta Scott in 1952.
Okay.
He was a doctrinaire socialist from his time, going all the way back to his time at Crozer. So this is not a man who just did bad things, because we all human beings, we all sin. This man engaged in deliberate, concentrated, protracted deceit from the moment he took to the world stage, from the moment he met his end in 1968.
Okay. Vicky, I want to give you a chance to rebut that if you wanted to, or it's up to you.
I would argue he was a follower of liberation theology that was part of Vatican II. I would definitely argue he was more of a follower of liberation theology.